Okay, I've got just a little bit after noon, and I know we're going to have a really awesome webinar, so don't want to keep us waiting too long. So I want to kick off and say hello, everyone, and welcome to our February Enhance webinar. Um, if you're new to this program, we offer almost monthly webinars that are open to the public. So men and women, DGN members, DGN non-members, everyone is welcome. But of course, DGN members get some special perks along the way. So if this is your first time joining, welcome. I'm Amanda Borkowski, and I'm the DGN staff lead for our Enhanced webinars. I'm going to kick off today with some housekeeping, some announcements, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bethany for a great conversation around calf care. We're really excited that you are here to join us, and I encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions and leave comments throughout the webinar. You can also unmute yourself and ask your questions along the way. However, we do ask that you stay muted until you are ready to ask a question to avoid any background noise. So if you can make sure you're muted, now is a great time to do that. If you are worried about interrupting, there is also a raise hand feature you can use if you are joining us from a computer or from a mobile, the Zoom mobile app. So you can raise your hand, and then either Bethany or someone on the DGN team will make sure to make space for you to ask a question throughout the presentation. There will be dedicated time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, but Bethany would really like you to ask your questions along the way as well. And then something we really like to do here is build community. And with that, we really truly do love being able to see you during these webinars. And our presenters really appreciate it too. So if you are able, we welcome you to turn on your video. We don't care if you're in the barn or in the office, your hair is a mess, it looks good. This is a safe space, and we want you to join without judgment and truly be a part of today's conversation. If you're having trouble unmuting yourself or turning your video on, make sure you click OK on the pop-up that says this Zoom is being recorded. Sometimes that'll hinder you from doing anything else until you click that button first. I also want to give a special thank you to Zoetis for providing the web hosting and recording of all of our enhanced webinars. And just a couple of DGN announcements before we get going. Not sure if you've heard, but DGN does have an online store. So freshen up your wardrobe this winter with the latest must-have merch. That's a little bit of a tongue twister from DGN. Whether you're working in the barn or you're out with friends, the items in the shop are perfect for every occasion. With everything from t-shirts to vests to crew necks, you can expect soft fabric, cute designs, and the perfect fit. You can explore our shop by going to our website, dairygirlnetwork.com, and clicking the shop tab, or there's also a link in the chat. I think my coworker Brittany is wearing some DGN swag as we speak. So, oh, Laura is as well. So you can kind of see two of those options in action right now. That's pretty awesome. There's still been a lot of hype around our last national conference that took place in November. I know a couple of you on today's call were able to join us in person in Kansas City, but if you weren't able to join, it was a great 3 days of learning, growth, camaraderie, and incredible speakers and topics. The agenda highlighted a variety of engaging speakers, including experts in dairy sustainability, herd management, career development, and all sorts of stuff. Keynote addresses and panel discussions featured insights from leaders who shared innovative strategies and practical tools for success in the dairy industry. But don't worry if you weren't able to join us, you can still access the recordings from all of those sessions. Our on-demand option is perfect to enjoy all of our breakouts and general sessions on your own schedule and within our really cool dynamic virtual platform. So head over to our website to see what sessions are available, and then also to sign up for on-demand. I recommend doing that sooner than later because those videos will not be available forever. And finally, if you love today's webinar, I really encourage you to sign up for our webinar subscription for 2025. Almost every month, we have interactive, informative webinars, just like this one's going to be, on topics from mental health, employee management, team building, herd health, and a ton of other topics as well. And in 2025, this year, our subscription allows you to get access to a year's worth of webinars for half the price. So again, head over to dairygirlnetwork.com to learn more and don't miss out on a great year of webinars. And with that, I want to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Bethany is a calf and heifer technical specialist with Vita Plus Corp, serving dairy farmers across Wisconsin and Minnesota in reaching their calf goals. She hails from northwestern Wisconsin, where she grew up and continues to manage calves on her family's 500-cow dairy farm. She earned her Bachelor of Science and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her master's from the University of Florida, where she studied the impacts of heat stress on early life calf development. All right, that's enough for me. We're here to hear from Bethany. So go ahead, Bethany, take it away.
All right, thank you. Confirming you can hear me and that my slides look good. Okay. All right, so when Amanda asked me to speak with all of you today, I kind of wanted to take a step back and think about things like the last Dairy Girl Network conference and the exchange page and reflect upon what kind of questions you as members or non-members had. What is keeping you up at night when it comes to raising your calves? What's something that you're considering? Because there's lots of buzz around different things in the industry. But unless you have the opportunity to go to a lot of farms like I have the privilege to do, sometimes you don't hear about whether or not they're actually effective. Do they work? Do they make a difference? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So Amanda did a really great job basically of covering everything I had on here. Basically, the only reason I threw this slide back on was to kind of give you a frame of reference for the biases that I might have when I talk about some of these trends. Because I have this background in science, because I consult with primarily Midwestern dairy farms, kind of in that smaller to medium range, because I am part of a dairy farm that's also within that range, that kind of frames my biases towards these trends. I want something that's incredibly practical for all of you dairy farmers to be able to use on a day-to-day basis to make a difference for your calves or for yourself and your time. So when I talk about these technologies or talk about these different scientific trends, that is my goal behind them. If they're not meeting those goals for me and for you, I'm probably not going to score them very high in terms of something that I would recommend for you to be using. So the trends we're going to talk about today are related to nutrition, management, and housing. Specifically, we're going to talk about a couple of feeding strategies and feeding technologies for our dairy calves, specifically mostly in like the pre-weaning period with milk. From a management side, really going to focus here on calf comfort and welfare and health. So this includes the processes of disbudding, or you might know it better as dehorning. We're going to talk about lung ultrasonography and the health monitoring ear tags that have recently come out on the market. Then we're going to wrap up with a little bit of information regarding pair housing. So I decided for each of these trends today to develop what I'm going to call a worth it-ometer. Is it worth it for you? And each of these trends is going to be rated based on the 5 categories of efficacy. Again, does it work? Utility. Is it easy to implement and continue to use? Is it cost effective? How does it impact calf performance and calf well-being? So you're going to see these graphics throughout the presentation, basically scoring each of these trends in these categories and telling you definitely this is something I would be considering for my farm, probably depending on your situation, and then maybe not. So diving right in, we're going to talk about feeding strategies. I sent comments out to the different social media platforms for Dairy Girl Network and myself, just asked you guys what kind of questions you had about kind of these hot trends. And someone commented and said she hears about the whole milk versus milk replacer debate. Now, this is an oldie but a goodie. I'm sure many of us have had this like back and forth, which one should I do for a long time? And long story short, the answer is it depends. It depends on a lot of different things. But what I'm going to share today is just maybe some considerations to keep in mind about some of the pros and cons of each. So one thing that we like to highlight at Vita Plus is reframing how we think about whole milk into the same way that we usually see milk replacers reported. So you might commonly see like, oh, if I have a milk replacer tag, it's a 20/20 or a 28/20. And what those numbers are, it's the protein percentage and the fat percentage. So 28% protein, 20% fat. So if we take whole milk and put it in to that perspective, basically just look at it at a dry matter basis, whole milk is like a 25-31. So 25% protein, 31% fat. Then mainly the remainder of the solids left in milk is lactose, around 40%. Now, when we compare that to one of our more typical traditional milk replacers that we've seen probably through like the 90s and early 2000s, that's typically like a 20/20 milk replacer, which means that there's going to be a little bit increase in the percentage left for lactose. Now, more commonly, what I'm seeing on farm, one of our most popular milk replacers, other companies' most popular milk replacers, are going to tick up those solids a little bit. So, proteins are going to be anywhere from like a 24 to a 28%. Fats will sometimes remain still at that 20%. We like to see it ticked up closer to 25% because this means that we're going to keep that lower lactose, closer to that of whole milk at 41%. So as we think about these progressive milk replacers, their main goal is to mimic whole milk as much as they can. So when we think about whole milk, what's working with whole milk without considering milk replacer? Well, one, I'm going to stress to everyone that if you are doing whole milk, I would really encourage doing the process of pasteurization. I'm sure we have heard plenty about that topic in the social fields these days, but pasteurization is a huge way to protect our calves from a variety of different pathogens, both those that cause scours, those that are related to viruses like the bird flu. It's a really great insurance policy for our calves. Another reason why many folks will choose to go the whole milk route is the apparent cost savings from doing especially non-saleable whole milk. So if you're pulling milk from the bulk tank from your treated cows or your very fresh cows, there is some cost associated with that, of course, because of lost saleable milk. But compared to milk replacer, it can really lead to some cost savings. I just got the question yesterday from one of our sales managers at Vita Plus, like, all things being equal, which one, milk, whole milk, or milk replacer is better for calves? And that's kind of a loaded question because very rarely are all things considered completely equal. We're going to dive into some of those differences here in a second, but let's say that it is. I think you could potentially see that whole milk is going to be the pull away winner for calf health and growth because we're able to get a little bit higher in that fat percent, as you just saw in the last slide, because there are additional growth factors and other little micromolecules that we don't even know what benefits they have, but they're really aiding in maybe calf gut development and growth. And so, again, if you could level the playing field, all things being equal, you might see some benefit from calf performance there. I also hear the feedback that whole milk can be more consistent. You're not relying on your feeding staff to have to measure out specific amounts of powder, to get the water to a certain temperature, to mix it to the proper degree. So consistency is sometimes a key word for whole milk. On the flip side, a huge reason why a whole milk may not end up working out for a farm is when we don't consider everything being equal. Labor and logistics is not going to be equal on every farm. When you have a pasteurized milk setup, you are reliant on your milk starting the pasteurized process at the specific time so that you can feed it at a specific time later. That also means that the milk has to get into the tank at a specific time. So you're just setting up this pathway for a lot of really timed and necessary items. So labor and logistics, once you get the framework going, it can be great. But depending on how your labor is set up, that's sometimes why I hear people switch back from a whole milk to a milk replacer because of the time constraints that they personally have or their employees. Another huge one is pasteurizer maintenance. Just was on a farm this past week where they decided to make the switch back from whole milk to milk replacer because their pasteurizer was getting to that, 15 years of age or so. And when we see this happen, a lot of the times we think our pasteurizer is functioning, but it might not be achieving the temperatures it needs to achieve. And we can actually see some detriment in terms of bacteria not being removed and some calf health issues. So pasteurizer maintenance can be a big pain in the butt. Biosecurity is also something I would consider. There are farms that go right to milk replacer because of history with listeria or more severe herd level problems. Not super common anymore, but it can happen. The other thing too is I think we often think that a pasteurizer is a catch-all. And we do have to remember that the amount of bacteria that starts with our milk does make a difference in the ability of the pasteurizer to be effective. So if we have very, very contaminated milk, we can actually lead to actually more of like a curdling cheese process when you pasteurize, or we just have a little bit higher bacteria milk at the end of the pasteurization process. Then finally, I kind of mentioned this before, um, especially if we're having to pull a lot of saleable milk for the pasteurization and feeding process, we might be missing out on some dollars and cents there. Just kind of depends on where the market sits. So on the flip side, what's working on the milk replacer side of things? Already mentioned, milk replacer can have some distinct advantages when it comes to labor and logistics. We have our pallet of milk replacer sitting right there. All we have to do is add in the right amount of powder, get that water in there, mix it up well, and it can make the process go a lot more smooth. Now, you might be noticing I mentioned consistency for whole milk. I also hear about consistency for milk replacer. This one being some of the things related to getting whole milk to the correct temperature can sometimes be a challenge from the pasteurizer. Or if we are not pasteurizing our whole milk, that could be a problem. It's a lot easier to kind of get that water up to that right temperature, get consistency in solids from the milk replacer that we're feeding because we're adding the same amount of powder every day. And so those are some pros for consistency on the milk replacer side. Again, calf health and growth can also be a pro for milk replacer. If we tend to have a lot of noise with our calves, like let's say that on average, our calves tend to do pretty well, but we also have just this subset of calves that just really kind of falls behind. They're not looking super thrifty. Even when they drink their milk, it's just they're not keeping up. Chances are they're going through some processes related to inflammation or poor gut health. And when we provide a milk replacer, many of those have additional nutritive factors that aid in gut support. So that can help reduce some of your noise, aid in gut health, and get a stronger calf from the inside out. Now, the other thing I would say is what's working from a milk replacer perspective is being cognizant of the type of milk replacer that you purchase. So the primary pieces of feedback that I get from milk replacer shopping, if you will, is mixability. Does it mix really easily? Does it cause me any headaches? What temperature of water do I need when I mix it? And I think we tend as farmers to grab onto the things that are really visual or really physical that we experience. You know, I'm not getting feedback on milk replacers being like, oh, I really like the amino acid profile. No, I'm getting feedback that this mixes really well and my calves drink it. So that's something that you should look for as well. Nutrient composition, though, can be important. Like I said, if you can see a slight tick in both fat and protein, that can lead to a lot of advantages in calf growth and health. So, what's not working with milk replacer? Being a calf specialist for a nutrition company right now is not the most fun because of milk component pricing right now continues to rise. So, you may see that if you are purchasing a milk replacer, that the cost per bag has gone up a little bit. That is the way market trends happen. We can certainly talk about strategies to try to limit some of the impacts that you might be seeing with that. But there's no denying that on a blanket basis, milk replacer is going to be more of an investment compared to whole milk. I mentioned before that depending on fat and protein percentage, that will influence the amount of lactose in a milk replacer. Something that we often don't think about is that this lactose can play a really big role in actually calf health. So lactose is what we call an osmoregulator. So it, depending on the amount that is circulating in the bloodstream, it will actually pull water from the blood and can lead to dehydration. So when we increase that lactose level, especially above levels of whole milk, we can see some dehydrating factors and maybe some nutritional scours. So again, that's another reason why focusing on a little higher fat and protein can limit some of that lactose and some of that potential for dehydration. Last thing I see when it comes to milk replacer is some concerns around water quality. Hard water tends to be a pretty big concern in the Midwest. Maybe bacteria count in our water. If we have issues with that, then sometimes folks are less likely to look for a milk replacer because they don't want to deal with mixing that type of water into their powder. So here's just a resource for you if going back and forth between whole milk and milk replacer is something you're doing right now. If you want to get really nerdy with it, this evaluator spreadsheet takes into account literally everything related to whole milk, from like the amount of electricity that your pasteurizer takes to the interest rate and depreciation value of the pasteurizer, the value of non-saleable milk, value of saleable milk, to determine where your personal break even is for your farm in doing a whole milk versus a milk replacer. Now, when it comes to my personal opinion on the worth it-ometer, I would say whole milk probably edges out a little bit over milk replacer. And going back to those 5 categories, the primary reason for that with whole milk is we do have a little more cost savings frequently when we consider whole milk over milk replacer, and the potential for slight improvements in calf health. But I work with farms across both spectrum, and I think it really, really depends on how you have your system set up um, as to which is going to work best for you. Last thing I want to mention with feeding strategies, just going to go over this very quickly. This was another question in the Exchange Facebook page. Number of feedings per day. Specifically, somebody was thinking about going to 3 times a day and wanted some feedback. There were really, really great tips in the comments, so I encourage you to go check it out if you haven't. But I will say, just in general, that 3 times a day feeding is gaining interest. The couple things that we have to keep in mind is, one, obviously, it's going to change our labor structure pretty significantly. And we also would then have to change how we feed across the day to still try to make these feedings as even as possible for calf consistency and reduced hunger cues. So this will also look like a little bit longer weaning, because we probably will be getting a little bit higher volume of milk into those calves by adding a feeding. On that note, I would target somewhere around 2 to 3 quarts per feeding. If you are exploring 3 times a day, there were some comments in that exchange sharing that they are trying to go up to 4 quarts or a gallon, or they've had success with it or they haven't. It depends a lot on calf size, but I do think if we get up into that 3 gallons per day range, we are getting a little bit high in terms of the capacity of our calves to consume milk without getting a little bit loose and losing interest in calf starter. But again, varies farm to farm. And if anyone here wants to chime in and tell me that a gallon works great for them, I would love to hear that. But for the most part, those 3 times a day farms I work with are somewhere in that like 2.5 to 3 quarts per day feeding range. Conversely, 2 times a day is going to be our most common. If we're doing that more traditional route, anywhere from 3 to 5 quarts per feeding is probably a target here. And I'd be very curious to hear if anyone on this webinar today is doing 1 times a day. This is a strategy that might work if you're doing something related to like acidified milk. But both the research and personal experience would say that it probably wouldn't be my first recommendation for you, especially in a milk replacer, because we're not allowing that calf to build up a big enough curd to keep her satisfied across the day. So there's going to be some increase in hunger cues. And I don't think I would enjoy feeding a calf after 24 hours of not eating. That sounds a little overly aggressive to me, but to each their own. Any questions or comments on feeding strategies before we move on? Not seeing anything in the chat. So let's move on to feeding technologies. Automated feeders are probably like one of the first and foremost technologies that we hear about. I'm sure we're all kind of familiar with the concept, but basically calves are housed in group settings, anywhere probably between about 10 to 25 calves per group. And then they can all go up to this nipple, and based on their RFID tag reading, they're allowed certain volumes of milk per day in certain increments. Now, auto feeders are great because they really allow for customized and higher planes of milk. So you can decide if you want that calf to get 8 quarts or 12 quarts per day. And you don't have to put any extra effort into making that volume difference happen. The auto feeder does it on its own. There are also benefits to that group housing scenario with social and cognitive development. However, it is important to note that most research would suggest that when we go over about that 15 calf per pen size, we start to see some negative impacts on calf health and things like that. So smaller group housing, if possible, in an auto feeder can be great. Now, my next bullet point, I intentionally call refocused labor. I think for a long time, there was a misconception that auto feeders meant less labor because, again, you don't have multiple staff members going out and feeding a line of calves. However, what you do have is a probably a little bit more higher trained staff member who is responsible for the details of pushing calves up to the auto feeder, observing calf behavior data, intake data to make decisions on calf health and performance. And so it still takes dedication, it still takes time. It's just a different type of time. So, on that note, a benefit to automated feeders is that data collection. We can have a good understanding of how all of our calves are eating, the speed in which they're eating, the frequency in which they're visiting. And some really cool research showing now is that we can take all of that data and develop algorithms to alert us to when calves are not healthy. So, when we can look at those different behaviors, it can actually predict respiratory disease anywhere from 1 to 6 days before that calf would be showing clinical signs. So that's something that I think I'm very excited about for the future market potential for anyone who's using those systems. But what's not working with auto feeders is that they can sometimes become little cesspools for bacteria. A couple of different audit studies have shown that bacteria counts are wildly variable and can be very, very high in auto feeders, as high as like 2.5 million bacteria cell counts when swabbing or sampling different areas in the auto feeder. So if you are considering the system or you currently have the system, being very, very cognizant of sanitation is critical. So washing off all of our equipment, both some of the automatic cleaning cycles that happen, the manual cleaning cycles, removing nipples 1 to 2 times per day is really important because when we don't meet these sanitation goals, we have increased risks for calf health. Generally speaking, you will have slightly higher increases in calf morbidity rates in an auto feeder setting, especially when bacteria isn't quite where it needs to be or when we're in those higher group numbers. So then the other two things that come on the not my favorite thing with auto feeders is the maintenance and cost. I'm personally not overly handy with tools and things like that. So when I see my customers who have auto feeders diving in and fixing belts and motors and circuit boards, I have a lot of respect for that. And I would not want to be doing that myself. So just keep that in mind that that can get to be a pretty big burden, especially as auto feeders reach that like 10 to 15 years of age. So I'm not going to belabor this too much, but I do like to provide some auto feeder recommendations because I do work with quite a few herds that do use auto feeders. Not surprisingly, they're pretty popular here in the Midwest, especially as you get a little bit further north, and we like to stay inside our barns when we can. And so backgrounding is a great thing to do for these calves. Keep them housed individually for like 5 to 14 days before we go into an auto feeder. Again, try to keep group sizes small as much as we can and reduce the age range within the pen to less than 2 weeks to avoid that pathogen spread. If you can manage it, all in, all out systems are great. Basically, that just means that whatever group of calves goes in together all leaves together before we put in a new group of calves to, again, avoid pathogen spread. And then as far as feeding milk goes, auto feeders are great because we can have both step up and step down programs for milk. And I set some parameters there for some of the mins and maximums that I would suggest for feeding volumes. So I recently did a webinar for dairy calf and heifer talking about different technologies. And one of the things I did for that was compare some of the costs associated with things that we might perceive to be a little bit more expensive because of the fact of being like a more robust technology versus the manual labor. And so compared a feeding program of about 80 calves on milk at one time, or about 500 calves per year, and what it would look like to feed them versus in an auto feeder versus milk shuttle or by bottle. And so obviously we're going to have a pretty disparate difference in feeding equipment cost. This includes base for the auto feeder, includes the unit itself, one unit, and a little bit of money put away for infrastructure, but probably not nearly as much as actual cost. Put in some cost for replacing and maintaining the equipment. Assumed that nutrition was a milk replacer fed twice a day, and that we would get maybe slightly higher volumes fed via an auto feeder or milk shuttle because they can meter out milk. Now, where the really big difference comes in terms of being a benefit on the technology side is labor. I assumed here that we had one person with a little bit higher hourly salary doing the work in an auto feeder versus 2 to 3 people feeding calves 2 times per day over about 2 to 3 hours. And you can see that as we add labor, that substantially increases cost. Also put in some estimates for expected morbidity and mortality rates in these systems. As I mentioned before, you might see a slight increase in morbidity levels in an auto feeder setting. But because we're feeding lower milk, you might expect that calf mortality when fed by bottle could be slightly increased. All that being said, on a year where you're not purchasing that equipment, you'll see that actually the bottle fed calves are going to be your highest cost. But the year, let's say that you're investing in all that equipment, it's pretty much even across the board. You're going to be spending about $200,000 to feed 500 calves per year, regardless of which system you're choosing. So all that to say, like, it really comes down, I think, to personal preference, maybe where you want to invest your dollars and spend your time. Do you want to spend it hiring employees to feed calves by bottle? Do you want to spend it maintaining auto feeder equipment? It's kind of up to you. Like I said, because I am not handy, my vote would probably be more in the less favored for the automated feeder and a little bit more on like the milk shuttle or bottle side. I think the shuttles give a really nice balance for amount of time input versus the amount of maintenance and upfront costs that you might see. So I did also just want to mention on that kind of milk dispensing unit side that there are a couple options for you related to that aren't quite as upfront investment like as an auto feeder, but save a little bit of time over hand feeding bottles. So these are things like a milk shuttle or a milk taxi, a bottle cart, or a tank. So these are very, very common on farms, especially as you get a little bit onto the larger size dairy. These are all metered in some way so that calves get a specific amount of measurable milk. Actually, all of them are mobile, so you can fill them up in your milk house and then bring them out to the calves. And some, like this shuttle and bottle cart, have some self-cleaning or self-pasteurization features. Any questions on calf technology? Okay. So now I'm going to dive into calf management strategies. We're going to talk a little bit about disbudding or dehorning, as I said, you might know it's called. Specifically, I'll share my bias up front. I'm a pretty big paste fan. I like caustic paste, and the statistics would agree with me. In a recent survey of U.S. dairy farms, about 61% of those farmers utilized caustic paste for their disbudding method, with about 32% using hot iron and another 6% doing like a surgical gouge or something like that. Not surprising that that number is low. For those that do paste, about half of it do it at that one-ish day of age, like right when they're born, and another 38% do it by that first week. Now, I do think it's important to note that 75% of those farms that use the caustic paste did report that they had to go back and repeat for a subset of calves. We're going to dive into what sort of repeat rate you should expect. Another thing we're going to talk about is pain control. Of the farms that disbudded, 50% used some sort of pain management. Majority of that was an NSAID, so something like Banamine or meloxicam. 50% used a nerve block. So obviously some have used a combination of these two pain management techniques, and 12% used a sedative like xylazine. Rosario, I'll get back to your question in a little minute. I'm going to finish disbudding and then I'll come back to that. Okay, so caustic paste disbudding. In my mind, what's working? Pain management. One form of pain management at this point is required by the FARM program, and I would tell you that I find it as the paster on farm. I find it to be helpful. At this time, we are currently doing just the NSAID, but I would not be surprised if one, the farm program starts requiring a nerve block as well through lidocaine. And two, I do see both the research and out in the field that there are some benefits to adding that nerve block to your disbudding method. It calms down calves a lot. It just reduces the pain and it helps aid in the recovery process. They really get back up and at it really quickly when we provide some additional pain management. I would say I most commonly see that paste being applied, like the research showed, within that first 1 to 2 days of age. That typically works pretty well because calves are pretty calm and they're not going to be fighting you too much. Many of you know I'm expecting right now. And so I'm only getting out to paste about once a week. And so the calves that I'm doing that are at the older age receive a few more curse words from me because they're not quite as calm when we try to do this process. It's feasible. The recommendations out in the field would say anything under 14 days you can do paste for. It just takes a little bit more paste and a little bit more work. So on that note, I want us to really be cognizant of the amount of paste that we're using. I'd be recommending somewhere in that dime to nickel size. So really we find that horn bud and we put on just over the top and then we spread it around to the edge base of that horn bud, but not any further. I'll just skip down to the what's not section a little bit here and say that excessive paste amounts are something that I do see pretty commonly on farm because we want to make sure that we don't miss it, right? I understand the concern and wanting to make sure that we get it right. But this really adds a lot of time to the wound healing process, and it's just not necessary. So working either as yourself as the paster or working with your staff to really limit that paste size can be a pretty big welfare consideration. Another question I've seen before is, like, hey, do I need to tape? Do I need to vet wrap? I think this is very, very farm dependent. I've heard that jerseys maybe are a little bit more playful with their paste, and so they might need to be covered. Certainly, if you do any sort of group housing, or if you're seeing a lot of paste being rubbed off on legs or the side of hutch walls, putting a little bit of tape or vet wrap over the paste can be helpful to avoid the smearing. But if you're not seeing those things, I think it actually kind of helps with the healing process to not include those as part of your program. The last thing I will say is that I tell my farmers to expect a success rate somewhere between 85 to 95%. And I would encourage you to have a plan for whatever percent is left that you do miss. Sometimes it's just a little scur on the side. Sometimes it maybe was the whole bud for whatever reason. So work with your heifer manager, maybe that's you, to establish a protocol for, hey, when are we going to check for horns and what are we going to follow up with? Typically that tends to be a burning, like right around, we want to avoid right on weaning, but sometime around weaning or maybe a little bit later. So the last thing I'll note kind of then on the what's not working side of thing is that stacking stressors. So avoid trying to disbud, whether it is paste, whether it is hot burning, when another stressful event is occurring. So a customer that I worked with was pasting on the same day where they're moving backgrounded calves to the auto feeder. And not surprisingly, calves were struggling on the first couple days on the feeder because they were just going through a lot. So if we can try to stack these, I will often try to avoid pasting if it's super, super cold. This can help our calves kind of ride through the stress of the disbudding a little bit better. So a couple resources listed here. There's some great general disbudding videos and hot iron disbudding example in this UC Davis video on YouTube, and a caustic paste protocol from UW Madison Extension is also available online. Actis Nutrition, formerly known as Milk Specialties Global, also has a nice YouTube video regarding pastis budding in Spanish. But they are going through their name change right now, so I could not find their video on YouTube. So when that becomes available again, I will let you know. And then when it comes to which one is more worth it to me, I think because of the ease of use, the extremely low cost, because of how quickly it is to do this process, my vote would lean slightly towards caustic paste over hot iron disbudding. But I understand if you like the increased efficacy rate of hot irons, that you might explore that. Okay, I want to go back to Rosario's question about high mortality in the bottle feeding. I think that's a fair question. Certainly, I would not expect to see like immensely high mortality from bottle feeding. Tons of people do it and have a ton of success with it. The only reason why I ticked it up a little bit higher in comparison to auto feeders or feeding via milk shuttle is under the assumption that this bottle feeding in particular was using a smaller bottle size, like let's say a 2-quart bottle. That kind of limits the volume that you're able to feed. And if we lower our total volume fed, especially in weather like this, we might be putting our calves at just a little bit increased risk for calorie deficits and a little less able to fight off infections, leading to a little bit higher mortality. I'm trying to remember. There's a nice set of PDFs, I think from UW-Madison or Purdue, that talks about some of the mortality risks. Oh, no, Iowa State. And I can get those to you, Rosario, if you want to see. But basically, they just say like, hey, we assumed some risks associated with each of these. And that's where I pulled some of these numbers from as well. But I certainly don't mean to say if you're bottle feeding that you're killing off more calves, because that is certainly not the case, especially if you're able to get higher volume bottles. All right. Any questions before I keep going? Okay, calf management. Lung ultrasounds are a really cool technology that are becoming available to help detect respiratory disease. So, how this process works is a trained veterinarian will come to your operation and they're going to scan each side of a calf chest. It takes about a minute or two per calf, and they're going to be looking at different factors within that lung, basically looking for striations versus solid masses and scoring it from 0 to 5 based on the number and size of lesions or the amount of total lobe consolidations within the lung. Now, we do know that calves that have higher scores, kind of like that 3 to 5 range, have been demonstrated to basically be your typical BRD calf. They have impaired growth, reduced survivability, reduced fertility, and can make less milk if they make it to the lactating herd. But a huge advantage to these ultrasounds is that they're going to detect issues before that calf becomes a clinical respiratory case. So there's going to be lesions in the lungs. There's going to be issue before that calf will necessarily show the signs of coughing or droopy ears. And so Dr. Olivet in this webinar that I pulled a lot of this information from, she called it know what's happening at the lung level before we know what's happening on the outward side. So this method, as you can imagine, is very accurate, has very high sensitivity and specificity. So basically, if that test says this calf is sick, it's very often correct. And if it says that she's not sick, that's even more often correct. Like you're very rarely going to have one that's missed. In this webinar, Dr. Olivet also does a cost benefit analysis because, as you can imagine, having weekly vet visits can add up in cost. But in the amount that you're saving in retreats of respiratory issues and calf mortality, this can be a very cost-effective tool, depending on your respiratory risk. I would also say that this tool works really, really well if you have specific questions that you want to answer. And they call this like some of the #WeanClean questions. So how many calves are showing subclinical signs of respiratory disease around weaning? If it's a high percentage, that means that things were maybe not going super great before we got to that time. We can also look at treatment efficacy. So we can scan the lungs before and after a respiratory treatment and say like, hey, did this drug that we used actually work to clear the respiratory infection? And then finally, they do what's called the 12/7 method, where they take 12 calves and scan them every 7 days to try to determine on this farm where the high risk age group is. And then that is the age group that would be followed for then on, either by ultrasound or by observation to say, like, hey, we know this is when respiratory disease tends to be a problem. And so we can keep a closer eye on this group. Now, I would say on the flip side, regional availability can be a struggle. So, if you do not have veterinarians that are properly trained through this technique in your area, you're pretty much not able to pursue this technology. It's pretty common here in Wisconsin, especially on the eastern side. In my neck of the woods, we're just starting to see some folks perform this test, but it's not super common yet. I would also say that I personally have a concern with it being a little resource heavy. Like I said, you do have to rely on a veterinarian visit on a relatively frequent basis. They do go through the process pretty quickly, but it just gets to be a little bit time intensive. So, that being said, if it is a technology you're considering pursuing, also make sure that you're going to utilize that data in a way that actually helps your operation. So, are you able to ask a wean clean question? Are you able to look historically at your data to say, hey, I've noticed X, Y, and Z trend? Because if we're not utilizing this data to make management decisions, it's not providing as much value. We have a question in the chat. What is a recommendation for how often a calf or group of calves should have the ultrasound completed before reaching 2 years? That's a great question. I think it kind of depends on which part of the wean clean that you're doing. Let's say that you've moved beyond kind of like trying to find that high risk age group. I would say typically what I see like Dr. Olivet and colleagues doing would be like probably a scan around 4 weeks and then another one around weaning and then one post weaning. Probably not much more beyond 4 to 6 months of age. Would you see going beyond that? Just because that's typically the time where a heifer might be going to a grower or something like that. I'm not hearing a ton of it being used in older heifers, but somewhere in that 1 to 3 scans would be pretty common. You would increase that a little bit more if you were having a lot of respiratory treatments and you were wanting to follow up on if those treatments were effective. All right, so my worthodometer for lung ultrasounds is I certainly would consider it. Again, you have to have it in that region, and I think it's very very important to want to answer a question with that data. There's lots of different questions we can ask, but let's not do it just to do it sake. There should be a reason behind it. Like I said, I put a lot of this data from a Hordes Dairyman webinar with Dr. Terry Olivet. She is an excellent resource in this field if you'd like to learn more. And the Dairyland Initiative has some resources as well. Health monitoring ear tags are another kind of health support tool. They're not going to be quite as robustly diagnostic as an ultrasound, but they're getting lots of buzz in the field, so we're going to talk about it. So basically how these work is they're placed in the ear around birth to establish some baseline behavior. And then there's an accelerometer in the tag that uses algorithms to detect and score both feeding and lying behaviors. So when that calf has behaviors that are not normal relative to that baseline, the tag is going to alert either through a light or through your app, and it'll say, hey, this calf isn't normal. We need to follow up for further assessment to see if she is sick. So again, not quite as accurate compared to lung ultrasounding, but still relatively precise disease detection and can detect things a little bit earlier compared to walking a line of calves. This is obviously going to be a little more labor optimized compared to scanning every calf via ultrasound. We're just looking for lights or looking for notifications. And it's nice too because both of the systems that are commercially available, you can put that in a calf at birth and can continue the tag through a lactating cow. My concern is with that labor optimization is that we might start to use this tool a little bit too much as a crutch. You know, hey, we see that light and automatically that calf gets treated. Even though when with the sensitivity at 64%, that basically means that there's a fair number of false positives. Like, hey, I'm flagging this calf as abnormal, but she's actually doing okay. So we might see a little bit of disadvantage there in terms of overtreatment if we're not properly training our staff to utilize this tool the way that it should. Of course, there's cost and maintenance that comes with this system. And I have heard concerns from farms about, oh, I'd like to invest in this, but I'm a little worried that the tags are going to start to fall out. So certainly something to keep an eye on. There are 2 ear tags that are commercially available right now. I am not here to promote either one of them, but that's where they are if you'd like to learn more. And until we have a little bit more field-based data, this isn't necessarily a technology that I would like sign everyone up for. I think we have to have the right herd size for the cost benefit analysis to check. And I would want to see some data maybe on some of the health and growth outcomes from using these tags before I could say this is a slam dunk. Any more questions on calf health? Okay. Last but not least, pair housing. I hear a lot of buzz about this one. Certain groups of people really, really love pair housing, and others are very hesitant to do it. And I certainly can understand both sides. So, in a similar study to the one that was done on disbudding, another group of farms was asked about their housing structures. About a quarter of them did use social housing. And of that quarter, about half of them were in some sort of indoor small group. 30% in an auto feeder, and the other 30% as outdoor pairs in like a super hutch or something like that. Now, of those in that social housing, 61% were that smaller group size in that 2 to 8 calves. We already talked about some of the benefits to that. And 90% of those were satisfied with that system. Some of the reasons for that satisfaction could be related to some of the positive outcomes from pair housing, like social development, improved starter intake and growth, and some benefits from the social license side. There's just a stronger consumer perception for keeping calves in some sort of small group. Now, that group that was surveyed does have some variation at when those calves enter a paired or group system. Majority were within that 7 days old, and then subsets a little bit even up to above 3 weeks of age. I would tell you from the farms that we work with, we actually have quite a few that are in that older age group when they start to pair. Some as late as 6 to 7 weeks starting or finishing the weaning process, then they pair. Um, just from a pathogen spreading standpoint, I think is some of the mentality there. So if pair housing is something that you're considering, my colleague at Egg Partners, Lindsay Borst, does pair housing on her home farm, and some of her recommendations would be to start with a strong maternity, so make sure colostrum program is buttoned up tight and that serum total proteins are doing really well for healthy calves. Make sure that we're not having a lot of variation in calf age or size in the pair. We want them to remain relatively competitive with each other. Strongly encourage feeding via a nipple if you're going to do pair housing. In that same survey, if you individually housed, only 30% fed by nipple, whereas 80% of pair housing or social housing used a nipple. So that supports kind of that philosophy. And then make sure we have the proper space. I know it's tempting, but when we say pair housing, we mean 2 calves in 2 hutches, not necessarily 2 calves in 1 hutch. We just get a little bit space limited if that's what we're going to do. On the flip side, the biggest downside to this pair housing system that I hear out in the field is the cross sucking. I hear a lot of frustration from that. And I would tell you on the research side that the folks that really love pair housing and promote it are doing a lot of research in that area. But I don't think we've come up with the golden solution just yet. So that same survey reported that individual housed calves were shown kind of having that like pen to pen cross sucking. We all know those calves that like to kiss across the panels. That was 70% of observations there, whereas 85% of calves in some sort of group housing had some cross sucking issues. We do know that there can be a few long-term implications from really severe cross-sucking, more issues of blind teats as lactating cows, and increased risk of mastitis. I really think it varies farm to farm about how severe that consequence is as at the herd level. The research that we do have to this point would suggest that we try to combat the cross-sucking by making sure we have a higher plane of milk nutrition, and again, that we're feeding by nipple. A little bit of work looking at hay provision, separating the perpetrator from the victim, but no golden solution for you guys yet if this is something that you're struggling with, unfortunately. So for that reason, I think there's a lot of social benefits. I'm very curious about the management style, but I don't know if I'm going to put it in the definitely category yet, because it really depends on how big of an issue cross-sucking is for you. If it is something that you are considering, though, there's a starter guide to pair housing available at the UW-Madison website. It's really great. They did a really great job with this. And general calf housing benchmarks can be found at the Dairyland Initiative. So I'm talking about like square footage requirements, curb height, things like that. Okay, I got a question, and that's perfect timing. Honorable mentions. Cow-calf pairing. There was a question. Some farms in Canada, Netherlands, and Sweden starting to keep calves with the cows, and they seem to be successful. Do you see this as a growing trend or just a passing hype? It is a growing trend. There is a handful of farms in the US, obviously not nearly as popular over here yet, because it's not as close to a legal requirement as it is in the European Union, for instance. I don't think it's a fad. I think it will continue to rise. I would be hesitant to put my foot in the ground and say that this would ever become a requirement for dairy farms in the US. I do try to keep up with that literature, though, because I want to make sure that, let's say, in the future it does become a requirement for our farms. I think there's a lot of management changes we would have to make on a lot of our operations to make a cow-calf pairing system successful. And so I think it's very important for us to keep things like pair housing and cow-calf housing in mind when we build our facilities or when we think about what's coming down the pipeline, because if we need to shift to those, whether or not it's required or because we think it might be a good option for our farm, we should have the infrastructure in place to do that. Other honorable mentions that I'm not going to dive into, but I'm working with a lot of farms now looking at things like feed efficiency. So does more milk and more grain necessarily mean more growth? Kind of depends. And then nutritive factors like oral paste and DFMs, direct fed microbials. You see lots of different comments on different products out there on the market with varying efficacy for farm to farm. So with that, if we have additional questions, we can certainly take them here. If we're not able to get to them, or if you're listening later, my contact information is available here. Email, LinkedIn profile, and then we offer a lot of resources related to these topics at our Starting Strong blog at Vita Plus.
Awesome. Like Bethany said, we do have time for just a couple of questions. So if you have anything you want to ask Bethany, please feel free to use the chat, or you can unmute yourself now and ask that way. This is a great opportunity to connect one-on-one with her. So get those questions rolling.
Yeah. I do have the video screen on this side, so if it looks like I'm looking away, that's why. I did see Rosario had a follow-up question about the bottle feeding. Yes, that study that I was describing was from a 2-liter bottle or a 2-quart bottle. Thank you for the compliments, Jennifer and Dagmar. Top tips for transition to first group. So Laura, do you mean like transitioning to an auto feeder or to post-weaning?
Post-weaning.
Post-weaning. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I think the first and foremost thing we need to do is look at our post-weaning age and take a step back 2 to 3 weeks. Let's take a look at our starter intake as we start the weaning process. Are we getting adequate intakes? Our general rule of thumb is when we start weaning, we like about 2 pounds of starter intake, and by middle, probably about 4 to 5 pounds, and end like 1 to 2 weeks after weaning, I really like to see 6 to 8 pounds of starter. The reason being is that as we increase our starter intake, this is an indication that that calf is able to digest and utilize the nutrients from starter to maintain her body weight and growth. I think we think historically about weaning being this like little slump window for calf health and growth. But if we get starter right, what we'll actually see is this like exponential growth as calves eat lots and lots and lots of starter and really shoot off. Like this is actually a window of time where we should be seeing closer to like a 2.5 pound per day average daily gain in that specific time frame. And so we really like to talk about how do we encourage that starter intake through that time, be it early offering of starter, fresh starter, having texturized starter, offering water. All of those things can help with that. When we move into that first post weaning pen, I like to make sure that we're 10 to 14 days after the weaning process is over. And it does sometimes help if you can carry over your feeding program. So let's say that you have a starter and you're transitioning to a grower, top dressing one on top of the other, either while they're still in a hut or they're pre-weaning pen, or when the first pen or two post weaning, that can help a lot, especially if we're switching to like a grower and a hay based post weaning diet, which is a completely acceptable form for that window of time. But if we can just ease that transition a little bit, that can help. Yeah. And so, Rosario, I just want to follow up on your comment too. This is a great reason why 3 times a day feeding might make sense. Um, let's say, I would it be more cost effective maybe just to get a larger volume bottle? Maybe. But let's say that you want to continue to feed in like a 2 quart bottle, a smaller bottle. To get adequate volume into our calves, that would really should be like a 3 time a day feeding. Even with the 3 quart bottle, 3 times a day feeding might be a better option. And so, yes, to your point, if we're getting up to 9 liters of milk, 2.5 mortality would not be, like you say, acceptable. The benchmark for our calves is less than 1% on average.
All right, we have time for one more question. Any other questions for Bethany?
We have one in the chat about respiratory disease. Let's see. BRD is an ongoing challenge on farms. Calves are kept individual well-bedded pens for the first 3 days near the lactating cows and close to the manure gutter. What do you think the impact of the setup would be on BRD incidence at a later age, or would they develop BRD in a few days? So I always like to preface respiratory questions with that I'm not a veterinarian. So certainly, if you are seeing, especially like a very early respiratory disease, I'd be talking with my vet about maybe some potential causes. But typically, respiratory disease tends to manifest itself after the scours window, so somewhere in that 4 weeks plus, and then another kind of spell you'll often see right after weaning. So I would not expect that you would see clinical respiratory case like in that maternity area in the first couple of days. You might have some throat irritation from the proximity to the manure pen, but chances are what will happen is whatever sort of pathogen load you have building up there will manifest itself a little bit later in terms of a scours outbreak at like that 7 to 14 days or a respiratory outbreak closer to 28 days. That's something that we do talk a lot about when we talk about calf housing is being cognizant of your whole farm footprint and where we're putting calves at different stages of the process. Because unfortunately, calf barns are usually not one of the first barns built. And so when it comes time for them to be built, the last remaining free space is often right by the manure pit. So that's something that we like to try to avoid, especially for lactating cow manure pits, because you can get some noxious gases that float over, or some airborne pathogens. And so especially scours outbreaks tends to be a problem with that.
All right. I think that's all we're going to have time for today, but don't worry if you do have additional questions you want to ask Bethany. Obviously, your email's here. We'll include it when we send out the recording too, so you can reach out one-on-one. Want to say, Bethany, thank you for a really, really great presentation. Really dynamic today. And also thank you to Zoetis for being our enhanced web hosting and recording partner. Like I said, you all should get the recording of this webinar next week, along with Bethany's contact info, and we'll also make sure that you'll either have the slides or at least the links from the slides, so you can click to learn more about some of those things that Bethany focused on. And with that, I hope you all have a great weekend, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks everyone for joining.